1 in 3 is intended for mature audiences. Episodes contain explicit content and may be triggering as they often include violence and other varying forms of abuse such as emotional, psychological, sexual, and physical. In most cases, names have been changed to protect all involved. Please note, statements and opinions of guests do not necessarily reflect those of my own. Hi, Warriors. Welcome to 1 in 3. I'm your host, Ingrid. Today is October 1st and marks the official start of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. This year's theme, as shared by the Domestic Violence Awareness Project, is With Survivors Always. It's a powerful reminder that survivors deserve safety, survivors deserve support, and survivors deserve solidarity. I am honored to be joined today by Captain Eric Threlkeld, who has dedicated much of his career to advocating for domestic violence victims. Here's Eric. Hi, Eric. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Of course.
So before we get into our conversation, could you give a bit of a background of yourself so the listeners can get to know you a bit?
Sure. So I've been in law enforcement for over 30 years. I started my career in New Mexico in a small city, and that I actually the same town I went to high school in. I eventually worked my way up to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I worked for several years with the police there. I spent several years in Colorado Springs with the El Paso County Sheriff's Office, which is kind of where I got my really strong interest in this topic of domestic violence. I had an opportunity to join a specialized team there called the Domestic Violence Enhanced Response Team, which was a multidisciplinary group of people handling the most lethal cases in a 2-county area. I took that experience and went overseas with the United Nations Police in 2000 in Kosovo, and kind of parlayed that experience with domestic violence into what I was doing there, training police at the police academy in Kosovo, and then I was the director or the chief of the domestic violence program for the country. The country was broken up into 5 regions, and we had international police in each region. And our overall goal was to train local police officers to take over. And went from Kosovo to Macedonia, North Macedonia, with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, where I trained police leaders, community leaders on Western standards of modern policing, a lot on community policing oriented projects, and domestic violence training as well. Eventually came back to the United States, worked for the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center for a while, again focusing on domestic violence. And now I've been with the Eddy County Sheriff's Office for about 14 years. Started out in patrol and working my way up to captain, all of which has been as a detective, patrol detective, sergeant, lieutenant, and captain, all in the detective division. And we're an agency of about 80 sworn positions, and I still overseeing the detective division and the divert program. I've helped create a divert program here as well.
So do all law offices have a domestic violence, do they have domestic violence training as part of their system, or is that something that's specific and depends on how remote they are?
So every academy has some domestic violence component to it, but it's woefully inadequate for doing thorough investigations. The average that I've seen around the country is about 16 hours of training out of the whole academy. So it's imperative that agencies do more advanced training once officers get out of basic training and start working in the field. And a lot of that comes through the field training program, actually responding to calls. It's trial by fire, if you will. But in my view, that really shouldn't be the case. We should have really, really well-rounded, well-trained officers before they actually go on the street and start responding to these calls for various reasons. One, they're extremely dangerous to everybody involved, including the officers who are responding. But that initial response oftentimes makes or breaks if the case is going to be successful, if you're going to save someone's life or not, and puts victims and offenders and children on the right or wrong path, depending on how you address it, and from the very first call for service.
So I was planning on going in a different order, but since you're talking about danger, a lot of people are talking about mass shootings, and that's always sort of on the top of everyone's brain. There's a strong link between a history of domestic violence and mass shootings. Is that correct?
Sure. Actually, statistically, about over 50% of mass shootings that have occurred in our country have a domestic violence nexus. You can go back to most of them and find that your suspect is either a domestic violence abuser, they grew up in an abusive home and witnessed a lot of domestic violence. Um, you will see that it's an ongoing theme, and if you go all the way back to the first recorded mass shooting that we had in the United States, I believe it was 1966 at the University of Texas, where the subject climbed up on a tower and started shooting students with a high-powered rifle. He killed his wife and mother before coming to that scene. So, and there's plenty of other examples. Dylan Roof witnessed years of abuse by his stepfather against his mother. You look at the Pulse nightclub shooting, the offender in that, the documented history of strangulation against his wife. So there's plenty of evidence. And one of the things I focus on in the training that we do with officers is if you be aware of that when you go into these situations, not only for mass shooting, but for suspects who strangle their victims. Officers are at a much higher increased risk of being hurt or killed by those suspects if they are stranglers.
Yeah, I remember reading, and I don't know the exact statistics, that it was around 75 to 80% of officer involved homicide where they were the person who was killed from a domestic violence offender who had previously strangled their intimate partner. So you had mentioned before multidisciplinary teams. What does that exactly mean?
So it depends on which context you look at it. So you've probably heard of the term a CRC, community response, or a community response team. There's different acronyms for it, but which is sort of a multidisciplinary group of people who get together on a regular basis and review sexual assault crimes and domestic violence related crimes, or maybe they have separate teams. They may have one for each issue, but you bring to the table the medical expertise, for example. We're probably going to have a medical doctor on that team, a prosecutor or two. In best case scenarios, you'll have a judge or two. You'll have law enforcement. You'll have nonprofit victim advocates, not for profit, but victim advocates who are attached to law enforcement agencies or prosecutors' offices, and probation and parole. Anybody who has a hand in the making and dealing with domestic violence offenders and victims in the community can be part of this group. And I've seen lots of different examples of how they function. Some of them can be very detail oriented. Some are looking at things from a broader perspective. You have some that are doing case reviews and deciding as a group how they might best assist the families or the people that are involved in these cases. They can be really effective. They're tough to hold together. You got to bring decision makers to the table in those things. For example, a chief of police sending a patrol officer to those teams isn't going to be very effective, because you've got to have somebody there when they're talking about policy changes, changes in protocols. It's got to be somebody in position who can say, yes, we can do that. And it's kind of like herding cats, getting all those people to the table on a regular basis, and it making those teams self-sustainable, where it's not all contingent on the coordinator to hold it all together. I've seen teams where a coordinator leaves for one reason or another, and the whole thing just kind of falls apart. But they can be set up and programmed well, and to carry on no matter who the coordinator is, and they're very effective. And another form of a multidisciplinary approach is a specialized domestic violence unit, like would be most likely within a police organization. The one I worked in Colorado, the divert team there was housed off-site. It was not housed within a police agency. The director of the program was actually a civilian position, which was unique for me. I'd never experienced that before. But they had a lot of funding from VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, to pay for all of this, the overtime and the building that we were in, and the electric bill and all of that, which was great. And the team was very effective. Part of the money, the funding they had, paid for a study that was done to show that it reduced recidivism. But it doesn't exist anymore because the funding went away. And I see that as a theme across the United States. It's hard to find specialized teams that just focus on domestic violence. There are some, and there's some really effective ones. But what I tell officers is, all of those people that make up those teams, they're still in our community. We may not be all able to all work out of the same office, but if we know who we are, for example, from a law enforcement perspective, if I identify a prosecutor who I know is passionate about these cases, I'm going to do my best to make sure they get all my cases. And I'm going, if I know a victim advocate who's really passionate about it as well, hopefully they all are, and we're going to reach out to them. We're going to maybe have informal meetings and kind of be the squeaky wheel on these cases and making sure that they don't get lost in the system. And it's a problem. We see here the successful conviction on domestic violence cases in my state, it's abysmal. It's less than 10%, and it's distressing. And we tend, if we're not all working together in a multidisciplinary approach, there's a lot of finger pointing. Officers are pointing their fingers at the prosecutors. Well, you dismiss the cases left and right. And the prosecutors are saying, well, you're not doing thorough investigations. You're not doing evidence-based investigations. And we can't move forward. We can't find the victim. The victim's uncooperative. There's all these gaps. And having a team can really mitigate those. But it does take a lot of work.
Well, yeah, I imagine a victim is less likely to be found or be cooperative if they don't have faith in the system that they're actually there to advocate for them. So it's almost, even if you got a team together and then even if it disintegrated over time, you're still opening those lines of communication with each other. Like how you mentioned, you can, what prosecutor to look for. There's a big disconnect you and I had been talking about previously in education for the providers throughout, like all the different specialties and positions of receiving the education on domestic violence and actually putting it into practice. And, I'm a nurse practitioner. I'm not really in the hospital anymore and I was never somebody who dealt directly with domestic violence victims, but we always had to have annual competencies just in case we did happen to come upon somebody who we would suspect domestic violence. But I can say that I probably was not prepared enough to actually really pick up on those.
Yeah, that's a good point. If I look at education on non-fatal strangulation as an example, nurses typically don't get that training in nursing school, and doctors aren't getting it in medical school. So it's tough if you have a detective or patrol officer who's working a strangulation case to go to a doctor in the emergency room and say, hey, this is what I learned. We really need a CT scan on this. And doctors are like, what? You're trying to tell me how to do my job? And you're like, no. So we have tools for them. We have some trifold cards that we educate officers. Hey, this is something you can give to a physician and say, look, this is the gold standard. Not my idea. This is other medical professionals who've decided this is the best way to give thorough exams on those kinds of cases. That can be really helpful. And so educating bringing those people into the fold in your response teams is essential to make sure they all understand. Paramedics is another example. They're a great resource. Victims will tell paramedics things that they're not ever going to say to the police, but paramedics write reports. But if they don't understand the signs and symptoms of strangulation, they may not ask the right questions, and often victims aren't volunteering that. You gotta ask.
Right. And so let's talk about non-fatal strangulation for a second, because those individuals you can't necessarily tell somebody's been strangled just based on the outward appearance.
Right. Yeah. So we know about half the time you're gonna have visible bruising, and only about 15% of the time are you going to see bruises that are significant enough to get decent photographs that might be able to use as evidence. So so half the time you're not going to see anything. So we've got to ask the right questions. We got to know, are you having difficulty breathing? Does this person have a raspy voice? Have they got petechiae in the eyes, bloodshot eyes? Are they lightheaded? Do they know if they've lost consciousness or not? All of things which can really exacerbate the situation. But we've got to identify those markers of strangulation, and it takes training, and it takes time to ask those questions. There's some really good assessment tools for law enforcement and for medical providers on reminding us what questions to ask. It's one of the crimes that we really want to know, not just strangulation, but domestic violence in general. Asking victims, how did this make you feel? Because often in a strangulation case, a victim is going to say, I thought I was going to die. We don't have to do that when we go to burglary calls. People are telling us, I'm angry, I'm upset, someone broke into my house, I stole my stuff, I want you to put them in prison. But on domestic violence, that's generally not the case. So asking people how they feel is imperative.
It's really also important to identify those victims, because I believe the risk of lethality following a non-fatal strangulation is extremely elevated. I can't remember the statistics right off the top of my head.
750%.
Okay, I thought it was
750% greater likelihood you're going to later be murdered by that person. And that doesn't mean you're going to be strangled to death. It could happen in a plethora of other ways. It's just people who use strangulation as a form of power and control are much more likely to kill you.
Right. So one thing that keeps coming up that everything I keep reading is trauma-informed individuals, that you want a trauma-informed attorney, trauma-informed judge, trauma-informed law enforcement to really understand what you're going through. What does that exactly mean?
I guess one way to characterize it is you got to have, there are specialized training programs specifically for trauma-informed interviewing, and they're somewhat lengthy, and it's probably, maybe I'm being a bit optimistic to think that every officer would get a chance to go through those. That would be wonderful if they did. But there's some basic things that we can all do as far as taking time to understand that trauma affects people's memories. It affects their responses to questions and to different stimuli that you may be experiencing. And domestic violence is one of those. If you look at non-fatal strangulation as an example, it's if you've been strangled to unconsciousness, you're going to have gaps in your memory. There's no way that once you're out, you're out. You don't know what happened. So understanding that, and understanding even if you didn't lose consciousness, that you may suffer from memory loss, even long-term memory loss, and understanding that victims who have experienced a significant trauma are not necessarily going to be your best victim. They may not tell you the story in a chronological fashion, which police officers, that's what we're trained over and over again. Everything's got to be chronological. And sometimes we try to push people into a box and make them tell their story in such a fashion. It's not practical. It's going to ruin your interview. It's going to probably ruin your rapport with that victim if you're trying to do that. So what I tell officers is, look, we all have body cameras. Most all of us do. If you don't, you've got some other kind of recording device. You can go back and refer to those recordings if need be, but let people tell their story without interrupting them. Let them tell you whatever is on their mind at that moment. And it may not be the strangulation. It might be uh, they're upset about they need their car keys back, or where did he take the kids, or how am I going to pay for this? And who knows? I give you an example of a case I worked years ago where the district attorney's office gave me a call and said, "Hey, we had a victim of domestic violence come in. She was upset because her case wasn't being prosecuted." And so we looked at the police report and we listened to what she had to say, and they don't match. There's lots of information that's not in the report. Could you please take a look at this? So I did, and it was a report generated by my agency, and the sat down with the victim and went back to the beginning, and what I realized was that she had been strangled, and nobody asked her about that. She didn't share that information with the deputies on scene. She did briefly mention it to the paramedics. She never mentioned it to the doctor at the emergency room. And there was a witness to that strangulation who was never interviewed, her teenage daughter. Because when she's telling me this story, she's saying, "Well, I came in and, he put his arm around my throat and he was punching me and I lost consciousness and then he drugged me across the floor and he pushed me out the back door." I think, "Well, how do you know all this stuff if you were unconscious?" And she, "Oh, well, my daughter told me that's what happened after I lost consciousness." Well, she wasn't mentioned anywhere in the report. So we've got to interview all the witnesses because you never know what people saw or heard. And it's just an example where the paramedics, she mentioned being choked. It was a term she'd used to the paramedics. They didn't pass it on to the doctor. So what I tell investigators is, look, if at all possible, go to the ER with your victim. Make sure that the ER physician knows that the strangulation occurred, and encourage them to do a thorough exam. Look for those signs and symptoms, or ask about the signs and symptoms, and look for internal injuries, because they very well may be there, and you're not going to be able to. Doctors can't see them either without specialized equipment, specialized tests. But the back to the trauma-informed interviewing, just not asking compound questions, keeping them simple and straightforward, letting victims tell their story all the way through without interrupting, and you can always go back and walk them through step by step.
So you actually brought up something that I wanted to point out is a lot of times when people think of strangulation, they think of someone coming from the front of them using their hands to actually put around their neck and maybe don't even consider the arm, I guess the sleeper hold sort
Right.
of, as that is actually a form of strangulation as
Right.
well.
Sure. And you can, ligatures are a form of strangulation. Hanging is a form of strangulation. So you can use your arms, your knees, your legs, all kinds of things, anything you can compress someone's throat with. And it's important to understand it can be your fingers. It doesn't take much pressure at all. Actually, only about 4.5 to 5 pounds of pressure to cut off the blood flow to a human being. And to put that in perspective, if you can open the soda can with your finger, you have enough strength to strangle someone. If you can pull the trigger on a pistol, you have enough strength to strangle somebody.
So, I mean, I know a victim's not necessarily going to be thinking of what terms to use if they're speaking to officers, but are there any key words or key terms that somebody would use that would kind of raise the red flag for an officer who's, answering a domestic call
About strangulation?
about anything that?
Oh, well, looking for, I think looking for signs that someone is in fear, looking at it, but those can be subtle clues, and not making the assumption that everyone's going to be upset or crying or angry. Some victims are going to appear completely calm, completely controlled, and that may be because they're basically immune to the process, and it's a regular occurrence for them. But we're all humans. We all respond differently to trauma. So we can't assume that. I've seen officers who have, well, she wasn't upset. She wasn't crying. Maybe she's not being truthful, and that could be the complete opposite. So you got to be open. Um, I'm trying to think of some other examples, but separating victims and suspects is imperative to doing thorough investigations. When oftentimes these scenes are very chaotic, so you have to get things under control before you can be very effective. You got to have at least 2 officers respond. One officer is not going to be able to do a very thorough interview because you need to separate your people that are involved visually, also auditorily, but you got to keep your partner in sight because officers have to remain safe. It can be quite complex, but so giving people space where they feel safe enough to tell you what's going on is imperative. I think, and making sure that, as I said before, all your witnesses are interviewed, and that includes children. But I'm not advocating that officers interview kids on the scene, especially younger children. That takes a specialized form of training. It needs to be a forensic interview, and that's where that multidisciplinary team comes into focus, because you're going to have to get those kids to Children's Advocacy Center where those interviews can be done in a safe environment. And if you start interviewing kids and locking them in on a story, you never know. The kids are very likely to want to protect one parent or the other, or maybe both, or maybe they're telling you what they think you want to hear. And if you don't have specialized training on how to ask non-leading questions of children, you can really devastate a case. So get them to a forensic interview.
That's actually a very good point, too, because they can be swayed easily or remember things incorrectly if they're led down wrong questioning. One point I want to make is that it is difficult sometimes to find out who the victim versus the perpetrator is, because a victim can typically present as the crazy one, more emotional, and the perpetrator can be calm and charming. And I think a very good case that a lot of us non-professionals were able to watch if we watched that documentary was the Gabby Petito case, when the police officers had pulled them over.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of a classic example. I watched most of that, and one thing I think, one tool that we use in my agency, which I think all agencies ought to use, is some form of a lethality assessment tool, a risk assessment or danger assessment tool, where you ask a series of questions that positive answers to are going to raise red flags on lethality. And I guess we're never going to know in the Gabby Petito case for sure, but if someone had asked her, have you ever been strangled, or ever had something put around your throat, if she had answered yes, it could have changed the whole dynamic of that investigation, because ultimately that's what her death was ruled, homicide by strangulation. There was no lethality assessment tool done that I saw, and there are lots of agencies in the country that don't have one. So that's something I would strongly advocate for.
And that's something that I think is pretty easy to find. I did an episode where I did discuss a lethality tool, and I did a simple Google, and I was able to find basic questions, not necessarily affiliated with a specific place, but I think it was the person who had designed the initial lethality assessment tool that I grabbed a few questions from.
Right. Dr. Jacquelyn Campbell is one of the
Yes.
premier researchers in this area, and there's a couple of different danger assessments out there that she was integral in creating. The one we use, the Maryland model lethality assessment program, is the one we use. And I'm not advocating for any one particular, but it's easy, it's straightforward. It reminds officers of questions that we ought to be asking in all of these cases anyway. For example, have you ever been choked or strangled? Does the offender have access to weapons? Has he ever threatened suicide? Do you have a child that he knows isn't his? Is he unemployed? Is he using drugs? Has he ever threatened suicide? All those are markers. If they're answering yes to, we need to be thinking, oh, wow, this is scary. And sharing that information with the victims that we're talking with, it's a really powerful tool.
I agree. So moving on to another topic that's maybe a bit sensitive is domestic violence.
Yeah, so officer involved domestic violence is problematic. We it occurs far more than I would like to admit. Being in law enforcement as long as I have, it's a bit disturbing. But the added risk for victims when your offender is a law enforcement officer is real. So we've got to be cognizant of that. We have to have comprehensive policies on how we're going to address these cases when they come to light. For example, there's a criminal component and there's an internal affairs component, and making sure those are clearly separated, and that in most cases, I would be opposed to an agency doing their own criminal investigation on a domestic violence crime where one of their officers involved. I think it would be imperative to farm that out to a neighboring agency, maybe an attorney general's office or a state police if you're a municipal or county organization. There are some agencies that are perhaps they're large enough that they can do that, but I've never worked in one of those. And I would suspect whether how effective that would be, but that's what we do in our agency is we would ask an outside organization to come in and handle that. But and even in those cases where it may not rise to the level of criminal charge, there needs to be an internal investigation to make sure that there were no policy violations and that everything is as transparent as possible, and that we offer support for victims, making sure that they're safe, that their children are safe, that we remove firearms from officers who are under investigation for domestic violence related crimes is imperative. Just having a firearm in your home increases your likelihood of being killed 500%. 500%. There's firearms in almost every law enforcement officer's home. I don't know of any agency where you don't take your gun home with you. So it's there, and we need to make sure that those weapons are secured until the investigation is completed.
And so, is there anything that like the average person can do? I guess maybe they could find out if there's any of these domestic violence multidisciplinary teams, or is there anything that the average person can do to advocate for something to be done in their local area?
Well, if you're really a champion of this subject, you could try to start one yourself, if you want to go that far. But if you're not in a position to do that, reaching out to your chief of your community or the sheriff in your community or the district attorney's office, and encouraging them to form such a group if it doesn't already exist. And if it does, see how you could participate. Some of them have a community member opportunity for community members to be part of it, and offer input. But I'd be happy to share any information that I have with people if they want to reach out. You can always contact me on LinkedIn, and I'll be very, very easy to share information with you. There are toolkits out there on the internet, specifically for developing CRCs, and that kind of a step-by-step process, everything from an introductory letter to guidance on who you need to bring to the table to make them effective, and branding information and all kinds of things that can make these teams a lot more successful.
Is LinkedIn the best way to contact you?
Yeah, I think that's really the only social media that I have much to do with, and that's probably the best way.
Okay. I'll include that link in the show notes then, if anyone does want to get in contact with you. So just wrapping up, is there any major message that you would like to leave as a lasting impression for listeners?
Well, for survivors and victims, I would say, look, there's a way out of this. There are people in your community that are standing by to help you, and I'm doing my best. My agency is doing its best to educate all of our members, that understanding that for most we know that statistically it takes about 7 violent occurrences before a victim actually gets out of those kinds of relationships. And we don't know which number we're there on. So we're always going to leave with saying, look, I understand you're not ready to get out right now, and for a plethora of reasons, which is a whole other podcast. But we understand the dynamics. And when you are ready, it may not be me who's here, but somebody from my agency is going to be here to help you get out safely. We're gonna leave you with a safety plan. We're going to leave you with contact information for the victim services that are offered in our community, and we're going to do our best to hold offenders accountable. And don't give up hope. We're going to help you get out of it.
Thank you so much, Eric. I think it's really nice to hear that law enforcement is on our side. Victims, I think, are afraid a lot of times that they're not going to be advocated for. So it's really, really nice to hear that there are these teams, that there are all of these soldiers on the ground that are working to make this a safer, better experience.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you again, Eric, for joining me today, and thank you, Warriors, for listening. I've included the links to Eric's 1 in 3 profile as well as his LinkedIn profile in the show notes. I will be back next week with another episode for you. Until then, stay strong, and wherever you are in your journey, always remember, you are not alone. Find more information, register as a guest, or leave a review by going to the website 1in3podcast.com. That's the number 1, IN, the number 3, podcast.com. Follow 1 in 3 on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at 1 in 3 Podcast. To help me out, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. 1 in 3 is a .5 Pinoy production. Music written and performed by Tim Crow.